It is a strange feeling to spend your entire adult life building a foundation, only to realize you have become completely unnoticed within the very walls you paid to erect. For decades, that was the unspoken rhythm of my life. My name is Arthur Vance. At 55 years old, I can look back on over 30 years of quiet labor, establishing a successful construction firm, maintaining a home, and raising a family in a peaceful suburb of Ohio. I was the kind of father who spent Saturdays coaching youth baseball and Sundays repairing the backyard deck, never once looking for a pat on the back. You show up, you provide, and you keep your word. That was the unwritten rule I lived by. I simply never expected someone else to tear up that agreement without warning. The beginning of the end arrived without any dramatic warnings, masked entirely by everyday life. My son, Ethan, was 28 when he introduced us to Chloe. My wife Helen and I were relaxing on the porch when his sedan pulled up the driveway. Watching her step out of the vehicle, the immediate thought that crossed my mind was that she possessed an intense, undeniable self-assurance. She walked with a rigid, elevated posture, entering our space as though she were the main attraction, expecting a standing ovation. When she reached out to shake my hand, it felt less like an introduction and more like a concession. "Chloe Vance," she stated calmly, already using our family name in her mind. "I've heard quite a bit about you." She didn't bother asking who I was. She had already gathered every piece of data she deemed necessary about Arthur Vance long before crossing my threshold. "Only good things, I hope," I replied, offering the standard polite response expected in moments like that. She offered a tight smile in return. Looking back, I had no idea that particular expression would turn out to be the most financially devastating thing I would ever witness. Ethan had always been a decent, hard-working young man. He wasn't without his flaws. He could be stubborn and occasionally lacked situational awareness, frequently needing someone to guide his focus when he was too busy admiring the big picture. But his intentions were always pure. He dedicated himself to his career and never missed his weekly phone call to his mother. When he confessed his deep affection for Chloe, I chose to trust his judgment. What I couldn't shake, however, and I kept this observation to myself because Helen insisted I was merely overanalyzing the situation, was the calculative way Chloe scrutinized our surroundings. During her very first dinner at our home, she glanced around the kitchen, offered a faint compliment, and then casually inquired if the space had been updated recently or if it was just intentionally vintage. Helen simply laughed, explaining that the design was original to the house. Chloe just nodded slowly, the way a person does when a prediction is confirmed. I quietly reached for the bottle and poured myself another glass of wine. The timeline accelerated rapidly after that. Within 8 months of their first date, Ethan called us to announce their engagement. Helen was moved to tears of joy, and I offered my genuine congratulations. My son was happy, and as a father, my primary duty was to stand behind him. The logistical preparations for the celebration commenced almost instantly, and within a fortnight, I received a clear indication of exactly what this milestone would demand of me. It wasn't a matter of finances just yet. It was a matter of respect. Helen and I met the young couple at their apartment to discuss the arrangements, bringing along a good bottle of wine and a supportive attitude. Chloe immediately produced a massive, color-coded organizational binder with labeled dividers, looking as though she had engineered this entire event years before Ethan ever bought a ring. "We are focusing heavily on the Whispering Pines Manor," she remarked, sliding an elegant marketing pamphlet across the table toward me. I picked it up, scanned the glossy photographs, noted the staggering pricing tiers printed on the back page, and set it down carefully. "It certainly looks like an extraordinary property," I observed. "It is," she countered instantly, noting that they would absolutely require the premium full weekend buyout. When Helen inquired about the expected attendance, Chloe calmly stated they were projecting around 280 individuals. I took a slow drink from my glass, processing the figure. 280 people. She explained that the list included numerous old acquaintances of her mother and several high-profile associates of her father. I turned my gaze toward my son. "How many names on that list actually belong to our side of the aisle?" I asked. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, mentioning our immediate relatives, a handful of colleagues from his office, and some old university friends. "So, out of nearly 300 attendees, roughly 60 are connected to us," I summarized. Chloe offered that familiar, sharp smile once again. Weddings are ultimately about celebrating the union of the couple, Mr. Vance, not about balancing a guest list, she said smoothly. There were many things I wanted to say in that exact moment, but I simply replied, "Of course." What many people fail to realize about funding a massive wedding is that the financial weight doesn't hit you in a single massive blow. Instead, it drains you gradually, like a slow, unnoticeable leak in a water line. First comes the initial venue deposit, followed closely by the catering estimates, then a floral consultation that somehow mutates into a $5,000 obligation. Then there is the exclusive photographer, whom Chloe insisted was the only capable professional in the state, a recommendation heavily pushed by her maid of honor and younger sister Clara, who possessed incredibly loud opinions on every detail, despite having no actual background in event planning. Every single time a new invoice materialized on the table, Chloe would lock eyes with Ethan. Ethan would look over at me with an unspoken plea, and I would look to Helen. My wife would gently but firmly place her hand on my forearm, a familiar gesture that clearly communicated, "Arthur, please don't fight this." And so, Arthur did exactly what was asked of him. By the third month of organizational meetings, the financial drafts I had signed reached a combined total of $41,000. By the time the actual wedding day arrived, the definitive sum would settle at exactly $58,240. I know that precise sequence of numbers the same way I know my own Social Security digits, and it will remain etched in my brain for the rest of my days. The harsh reality of financing someone else's grand vision is that appreciation possesses a very short shelf life. In Chloe's case, I am convinced that gratitude completely evaporated around the second week of preparations, right when she deduced that the funding would keep flowing regardless of how dismissively she treated me. She was entirely correct about the money, but she was fundamentally wrong about what that meant for our long-term dynamic. The 6 months leading up to the ceremony served as a profound education for me. I quickly discovered that Chloe referred to my practical logistical suggestions as "darling" or "sweet," using the exact patronizing tone one might use to praise a toddler's messy finger painting. I observed that whenever Helen attempted to offer an opinion regarding the table arrangements, Chloe would nod with forced patience, only to proceed with whatever layout she had originally intended. I watched as Ethan, bless his heart, was systematically conditioned to yield to his partner on every single variable tied to the celebration, alongside a substantial number of decisions entirely unrelated to it. During this period, I also truly got to know Clara. At 25, Chloe's younger sister operated effectively as a forward scout for the bride's agenda. She would regularly arrive at our planning sessions 15 minutes ahead of schedule, brief the vendors on Chloe's rigid creative vision, and skillfully neutralize anyone who dared to deviate from the established plan. She conducted herself with the cold, diplomatic efficiency of a military strategist, a trait I actually found myself respecting even when its trajectory was aimed directly at my wallet. "Mr. Vance," Clara remarked to me during an expensive cake tasting session in early spring, "Chloe is simply trying to ensure that absolutely everyone feels recognized and included in this journey." "That is exceptionally thoughtful of her," I replied, chewing a sample of artisanal vanilla bean cake that cost more than the first pickup truck I ever owned. "She truly respects your perspective," Clara added with a pleasant smile, "even if the final execution doesn't perfectly mirror your initial suggestions." "Clara," I said quietly, "I have been happily married for over 3 decades. I understand exactly how that dynamic operates." She let out a genuine laugh at that, and I think we reached a mutual understanding right then and there. A week before the actual event, Chloe's father arrived in town. Marcus Sterling was a towering individual with a crushing grip and the unshakable aura of a man who had spent 40 years commanding boardrooms as a high-powered corporate litigator. He checked into the hotel suite under my account, given that the entire room block fell under the comprehensive venue package I was funding. What became immediately apparent was that Marcus had absolutely no intention of offering a financial contribution toward the event. Not a single dollar, not a gesture of assistance, not an envelope. He flew in from Seattle and stepped seamlessly into the ceremonial role of the proud father of the bride, fully enjoying the prestige of the position while completely bypassing the accompanying financial liability. I brought this up to Helen in our room on Thursday evening, just before the rehearsal dinner took place. "Arthur," she sighed softly, "you sound incredibly bitter." I am not bitter, I corrected her. I am simply making a logical calculation. I am $58,000 past bitter. At this point, I am merely fascinated by the audacity. She kissed my cheek gently, whispering that it would all be over in 48 hours. I nodded silently. 2 more days. The rehearsal dinner was hosted at an upscale bistro downtown, and the bill went directly to my credit card. Ethan delivered a moving speech that brought tears to his mother's eyes. Marcus gave a polished, highly eloquent toast centered entirely on Chloe's brilliance, making absolutely no mention of my family or our support. Clara followed with a witty, genuinely humorous speech that actually had me laughing along with the rest of the room. As Clara sat back down, Chloe caught my gaze from across the long table. "Thank you for making all of this reality, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sounding entirely sincere. "We truly mean it." And the remarkable thing is, I actually believed her in that moment. I genuinely did. The wedding day itself was flawless. I want to emphasize that clearly, because the aesthetics were undeniable. The Whispering Pines Manor looked spectacular beneath the crisp late September sunshine. The floral arrangements were breathtaking, cascading white blossoms interspersed with deep velvet dahlias that Helen had quietly advocated for during an exhausting planning session months prior. The catering was superb, and the live string ensemble during the cocktail hour played the classic jazz standards I had requested, with no one letting on that my preferences had originally been dismissed. I accompanied Ethan down the aisle toward the altar. He looked incredibly sharp, though visibly anxious. Just before we reached the minister, he looked at me with immense gravity and said, "Dad, I need you to know how much—" "I already know, son," I interrupted softly. He nodded, and I nodded back. I managed to keep my composure throughout the vows, while Helen wept joyfully enough for both of us. Standing at the front alongside Marcus, watching my only son commit his life to a woman I harbored deep, unvoiced reservations about, I comforted myself with a singular thought. No matter what the future holds, I gave him this launch pad. This is my gift, and no one can diminish that. Then the cocktail hour concluded, the grand reception commenced, and someone stripped that comfort away from me in an instant. To fully grasp what occurred next, you have to understand the layout of the reception hall. The venue featured 2 distinct guest areas. The first was the expansive main floor, which held the standard circular tables decorated with the floral centerpieces surrounding the central dance floor, with the elevated head table positioned directly up front for the wedding party. The second space was a beautiful terraced mezzanine to the left. It was prominently raised, offering far superior views of the entertainment stage and the entire room. I later discovered that Chloe had explicitly instructed the venue's event coordinator to classify this specific upper level as the premium seating zone. An usher escorted Helen and me directly to the main floor, leading us to table 7. Initially, I didn't think twice about the placement. I assumed our seats were chosen due to their proximity to the bar, the main exit, or the dance floor. I pulled out Helen's chair, sat down, and looked over the printed place cards to see who else was assigned to our circle. The names read Sterling, Marcus, Sterling, Evelyn, Vance, Thomas, Vance, Angela. It was Chloe's parents along with her aunt and uncle. I leaned back and cast my eyes up toward the terraced mezzanine. There was a beautifully decorated table situated right at the edge, featuring a massive centerpiece double the size of ours. "Helen," I murmured quietly, gesturing slightly with my chin. "I see it, Arthur," she replied, her voice tightly controlled. "Who exactly is seated up there?" Helen stood up and walked over to the beautifully framed seating chart displayed near the main entrance. When she returned, her face carried an expression I hadn't seen since the afternoon Ethan accidentally totaled my favorite truck when he was 16. "Arthur," she whispered, leaning in close, "do you know who is occupying the premium tier?" "Tell me." "Chloe's university friends and her old sorority sisters. Her college bridesmaids are in the premium seats, Arthur, and we have been placed down here at table 7. I stood up immediately. I want to make it absolutely clear that I was completely composed. My voice did not shake, my hands remained perfectly steady, and my heart rate was probably a calm 60 beats per minute. I have navigated incredibly difficult challenges throughout my life. I built an entire enterprise from the ground up using nothing but a single work truck and a basic tool belt. I know how to maintain control. I walked smoothly across the floor toward the wedding coordinator, a pleasant woman named Sarah, who was wearing a communication headset and holding a detailed clipboard. "Excuse me, Sarah," I said politely. "I am the father of the groom. I was hoping you could double-check our table assignment. I believe there might have been a minor mix-up with the arrangements." She looked down at her digital manifest, running a finger along the columns. "Arthur Vance. Yes, sir, you are confirmed for Table 7. It's right over this way." "I just came from Table 7, I replied evenly. "I am asking if that placement is actually correct, or if a mistake was made during the final layout." She glanced at her clipboard once more, looked up at me, and then stared back down at her screen for a long moment. "No, sir. Table 7 is exactly where the bride instructed us to place you. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" I looked up at the elevated mezzanine packed with laughing or sure, something college graduates, and then looked back down at the folding chairs at Table 7. "No," I said softly. "Thank you for checking." I walked back to our table and took my seat. Helen reached over and placed her hand firmly over mine. "It's fine," I told her. But it was not fine. The moment the formal introductions concluded, the reality of the situation solidified. About 40 minutes into the dinner, while the salad course was being served, I found myself waiting. I suppose part of me was expecting some form of public acknowledgement, perhaps a brief toast recognizing the immense support Helen and I had contributed, or a simple gesture of appreciation. Some small validation that the past 6 months of planning and $58,000 of my hard-earned money had registered as significant somewhere in Chloe's mind. Instead, what I got was Chloe herself. She materialized right at my elbow during the meal, looking absolutely radiant in her bridal gown, holding a half-empty flute of champagne. She bent down slightly and spoke directly into my ear. Her tone wasn't malicious or mocking. It was completely casual, delivered in the exact same conversational manner one might use to announce the daily soup special at a diner. "Arthur, I truly hope you and Helen are enjoying yourselves tonight," she said smoothly. "I just wanted to gently remind you that the upper-level seating is strictly reserved for the core wedding circle. If you could just remain down here and enjoy the rest of the evening from this table, that would be wonderful. You're here as our guest, after all." I turned my head and looked her dead in the eyes. "You're here as a guest," she repeated, dropping her voice slightly, as if offering a helpful reminder to someone who had forgotten their place. I didn't utter a single syllable. She straightened back up, flashed that bright, superficial smile, and glided effortlessly back toward the head table. I sat completely motionless for roughly 15 seconds. Then, I picked up my fork and resumed eating. Helen was staring at me, her eyes wide with concern. "Arthur, please," she whispered. "Eat your salad, Helen," I said calmly. "Arthur, what did she just say to you?" "She informed me that I am a guest," I replied. "So I am going to sit right here in this chair and be an exceptional guest." Helen slowly lowered her fork onto the cloth. "I am completely fine," I assured her. But deep down, something had just shifted inside me. It happened quietly, the exact way a massive central furnace shuts down at the end of winter. There was no theatrical display, no loud outburst, and no sudden explosion. It was simply the flipping of a breaker, leaving nothing but an absolute icy silence where the warmth used to be. I watched Ethan for the remainder of the celebration. To be perfectly fair to my son, he did not look at ease. He danced with his new wife, laughed with his groomsmen, and clinked glasses with Marcus and his old fraternity brothers, but twice, I caught him staring across the crowded room directly at me. There was an expression in his eyes I couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was the distinct, heavy helplessness of a man who realizes something is profoundly wrong, but has already decided it is far too late to correct it. I did not cross the floor to join him, and he did not walk over to me. Around 9 o'clock, I leaned over to Helen and told her I was going to step out for some fresh air. I walked out onto the grand stone terrace of the Whispering Pines Manor, which overlooked an expansive garden softly illuminated from below. White blossoms and deep velvet dahlias stretched out as far as the eye could see, $58,000 worth of breathtaking scenery. Marcus Sterling stepped out onto the terrace and found me there about 10 minutes later. "Quite a night," he remarked, holding a lowball glass. "An extraordinary venue," I replied, nodding toward the grounds. We stood in what felt like a comfortable silence for a moment. just two fathers observing the aftermath of a wedding. Then Marcus took a sip of his drink and sighed. Chloe can be an immense force to deal with. She always has been, he admitted, a trace of weary pride bleeding into his tone. She targets what she wants and she secures it. Her mother has always called it sheer determination. What do you call it? I asked, keeping my eyes on the horizon. He offered a faint smile into his whiskey glass. Expensive. I let out a short laugh. I hadn't intended to, but the honesty caught me off guard. Marcus looked over at me, his smile fading slightly. In all seriousness, Arthur, I really should have contributed more to the financing of this event. Yes, I replied evenly, turning my head to look him squarely in the face. You really should have. He caught his breath for a split second, looking at me sideways. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod, turned around, and walked back inside toward the music. Later that evening, lying awake in the hotel room that Helen and I had paid for, I arrived at a definitive conclusion. It was not an angry decision, nor was it an impulsive reaction driven by malice. I want to emphasize this point with absolute clarity, because the steps I took next would later be categorized by Chloe's circle as a temper tantrum, a petty retaliation, or the wounded pride of an aging patriarch. It was none of those things. It was simple, cold arithmetic. Cold. I had completely financed the wedding of Chloe's absolute dreams. In return, she had stood in that room, looked me in the eye, and explicitly reminded me that I was merely a guest in a space I had entirely purchased. I did not cause a scene. I did not humiliate my son in front of his peers. I remained in my designated seat at table 7, finished my meal, and smiled warmly whenever the photographer pointed a lens in my direction. But I am a man who builds structures for a living. And any man who understands how to build also knows exactly how to stop providing the materials. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, opened a blank memo, and typed 2 words to myself. That note would serve as my definitive blueprint when the inevitable moment arrived. That moment materialized exactly 31 days later. Ethan and Chloe had departed immediately after the wedding for their honeymoon, a 2-week excursion through the countryside of Tuscany. To their credit, they had budgeted, planned, and financed that vacation entirely on their own, a fact I genuinely respected. They had been back in the country for a mere 3 days when my phone rang. It wasn't Ethan calling. It was Chloe. Helen was busy in the kitchen preparing dinner when the call came through. I opted to take it in my home office, sitting securely in the leather chair behind the oak desk, where I had signed every single wedding check over the previous 6 months. "Arthur!" Chloe's voice boomed through the speaker, sounding exceptionally warm, vibrant, and freshly tanned from the Mediterranean sun. "I hope I'm not disrupting your afternoon." "Not at all," I replied neutrally. "I just really wanted to reach out because Ethan and I have been reviewing everything since our return," she began smoothly. "We are both just so incredibly grateful for everything you and Helen did to make the wedding happen. It truly felt like the most magical day imaginable." "It was a highly coordinated event," I noted. "It certainly was." There was a brief, calculated pause on the line. "So," Chloe continued, her tone shifting into a casual conspiratorial register, "we've been diving deep into our long-term financial planning since getting back and, well, you know how these things go. Weddings pull a massive amount of liquidity out of your accounts." "They certainly do," I agreed. "Exactly. And Ethan and I had previously discussed the idea of potentially taking a secondary trip a bit down the road, almost like an extended delayed honeymoon to Japan. It has literally always been an absolute dream of mine." "Of yours," I emphasized quietly. "Of ours," she corrected seamlessly, without missing a single beat. "And we were honestly wondering, given how unbelievably generous you were with the manor and the catering, whether you might be open to assisting us with a venture like that. Just a comfortable contribution, whatever dollar amount feels right to you." I sat in complete silence, letting the empty space stretch out over the line. "Arthur, are you still there? Is this a bad time to talk?" "No," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "This is actually the perfect time. I have been anticipating this exact conversation, Chloe." "Oh?" The warmth dropped out of her voice, replaced instantly by a sharp, alert quality, the sound of an animal that has suddenly detected an unfamiliar movement in the brush. "Chloe," I said calmly, "do you happen to recall the specific words you whispered to me during the reception dinner?" Total silence met my question. Right at table 7, I continued. You leaned down and told me something, and I want to ensure I am remembering the phrasing with absolute accuracy. You told me, "You're here as our guest." Isn't that right? The silence on the other end grew heavier. I've spent the last month reflecting deeply on that statement, I told her. And the reality is, you were completely correct. I was a guest at that wedding, and guests do not finance international vacations, so my answer is no. Arthur, I think there has been a massive misunderstanding here, Chloe said, her voice dropping into a very quiet, rigid tone. There is absolutely no misunderstanding, I replied smoothly. Your communication at the reception was flawless. You made it clear that my role was strictly that of an attendee, so I am going to conduct myself accordingly going forward. Attendees provide standard housewarming gifts and retail gift cards. They do not draft checks for international vacations. The phone line remained completely silent for several seconds. I am going to discuss this directly with Ethan, she stated coldly. Please do, I said. He knows my number, and I am always happy to speak with my son. I ended the call, placed the device back on the desk, and sat quietly in my chair. My hands were perfectly steady, and my heart rate was still sitting at a comfortable 60 beats per minute. I felt the profound relief of a craftsman who had just completed a long, exhausting project. Ethan called me later that same evening. I will not pretend that the conversation was painless. It wasn't. He sounded deeply wounded, incredibly confused, and he threw accusations at me that stung. Not because they were vicious, but because they were coming from my own son rather than his wife. He told me I was being incredibly petty. He claimed I was systematically punishing Chloe over a trivial matter like a seating chart. He mentioned that Helen was caught in the middle and deeply stressed by the tension. I remained completely silent until he had exhausted his anger. Ethan, I love you, I said firmly. I financed that entire wedding because you are my son, not because I expected a single thing in return. But I refuse to be told that I am merely an outside spectator in a room I entirely paid for, only to be approached as a source of capital for the next luxury trip. That is a boundary I will not allow anyone to cross. Not for me. She didn't mean it the way you're taking it, Ethan muttered, his voice dropping. She stated it twice, son, I replied quietly. That isn't a lapse in judgment. That is an established perspective. He fell silent for a long time, the weight of the situation finally settling on him. I need you to understand something clearly, I continued. I am not cutting off my relationship with you. I am simply closing the open wallet. Those are two entirely separate concepts. If you want to come over this Sunday, the grill will be hot. Your mother will make that loaded potato salad you love. But I am no longer operating as a financial institution that happens to be your father. He disconnected the call without giving me a definitive answer. When Sunday arrived, Ethan pulled up the driveway completely alone. We fired up the grill, your mother served the potato salad, and we collectively avoided a single mention of the wedding or the phone calls. Instead, we spent the afternoon watching the game and arguing intensely about the team's defensive line. I had 2 cold drinks and fell completely asleep in my armchair before the final whistle blew. It was the most peaceful afternoon I had experienced in over a year. In the weeks that followed, Chloe did not accept the boundary with grace. She contacted Helen on 2 separate occasions, presenting a heavily distorted narrative where I was painted as an incredibly controlling, difficult patriarch who was using wedding finances as a tactical power play to dominate their marriage. Helen listened with forced politeness until Chloe finished her grievances. After the second call, Helen walked into my office and sat down opposite me. She is actively attempting to rewrite the entire history of this family, she noted. I am well aware, I said, and Ethan is caught directly in the crossfire. I know that as well. What do you think we should do? I took a moment to look out the window before answering. Absolutely nothing, I told her. I don't have to lift a finger. The truth is perfectly capable of surviving without my intervention. Helen observed me for a prolonged moment, her brow furrowed. You have been remarkably detached throughout this entire process, Arthur. I have been completely detached since table 7, I replied with a faint smile. You don't need to worry. What I had purposely omitted from my conversations with Helen, Ethan, and certainly Marcus Sterling on that terrace was the specific action I had taken the morning immediately following the reception. While Helen was still fast asleep in our hotel room, I had sat by the window with a cup of black coffee and placed a call to my long-term accountant, an incredibly sharp professional named Stephanie. She had managed my construction company's corporate ledger for over 11 years and had never once committed an oversight. I instructed her to initiate an immediate, comprehensive audit of every personal asset, corporate holding, and financial instrument that carried a designated beneficiary wrapper. Stephanie didn't ask for a justification. That level of professional discretion is exactly why she has remained in my employ for over a decade. The initial evaluation required 3 weeks of deep analysis, and the actual execution of the changes took another 2. By the exact afternoon Chloe called me to request the vacation funding, the entire restructuring had already been legally finalized. My construction firm, the entire enterprise I had built brick by brick from the back of a single truck, had been completely transferred into a uniquely structured private trust under very specific parameters drafted by my corporate attorney. The conditions were exceptionally clear. The primary beneficiary of the trust was Helen Vance. Upon her eventual passing, the remaining equity would dissolve to Ethan Vance, under the strict legal condition that he was not, at the designated time of asset distribution, party to a marriage that had been determined by legal counsel to involve documented financial coercion or undue external influence. When my attorney originally suggested that specific clause, I wondered if it was perhaps too aggressive. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Arthur, you have spent your entire life sweat equity building this legacy. You are well within your rights to construct a wall around it." I signed the paperwork without further hesitation. There was one final adjustment. Our primary residence, the home I had personally renovated room by room over the course of 2 decades, including the exact kitchen Chloe had dismissed as vintage, was legally transferred entirely into Helen's name alone, completely dissolving our joint tenancy. I want to be perfectly clear about my motivations. I did not execute these changes out of hatred or anger. I did it because a master builder understands that when a structure is built, you must also install the proper systems to protect it from elements that mean it harm. I had spent 6 months observing Chloe's calculated strategic displays of affection, and I recognized the pattern immediately. She was a long-game strategist. The wedding was merely the proof of concept. The request for the honeymoon funding was her opening move. I had no idea what her subsequent play would be, but I ensured the foundation was completely reinforced before she could make it. The subsequent move occurred 4 months later, and it took a form I never could have anticipated. Chloe officially filed legal paperwork through her personal attorney, demanding a line-by-line corporate accounting of every financial expenditure tied to the wedding celebration. To this day, I am still not entirely certain what grand strategy she believed she was executing. Her legal counsel forwarded a formal demand letter, hinting that my substantial financial backing of the wedding had established an ongoing, implicit familial obligation, thereby entitling the young couple to continued, proportional baseline support to maintain their lifestyle. I read through the document 3 times, completely amazed by the audacity. Then I dialed my attorney. He reached out to their legal representative, and Chloe's counsel received a very direct, highly organized response packet in return. The file contained certified copies of every single check I had signed, every corporate invoice I had cleared, and every vendor contract I had personally executed. Every piece of paper bore my signature alone for an event that Chloe had explicitly designated me to attend as a mere spectator. At the very bottom of the cover page, my attorney added a single definitive statement that I had personally approved. Mr. Vance notes with finality that as an uncompensated guest of the event in question, he holds 0 outstanding financial liabilities to the newlyweds and considers this matter permanently resolved. I have no way of knowing if Chloe ever willingly shared that correspondence with my son. What I do know is that Ethan called my cell phone 2 days later. The entire tone of his voice had shifted. He spoke in a much quieter, subdued register that immediately transported me back to when he was 12 years old, standing in the garage after breaking something expensive, trying to summon the courage to confess. "Dad," he murmured. "I'm right here, son," I replied. There was a massive, heavy pause over the line. "I had absolutely no idea she had her attorney send that letter to you." "I figured as much, Ethan," I said gently. "I am so incredibly sorry." Those 2 words hung in the air between us, and I simply let them rest there. "You don't ever have to offer apologies for the actions of another adult, son," I told him. "But I truly appreciate you saying that." She's He cut himself off, took a ragged breath, and started the sentence again. She is fundamentally not the person I believed she was. I'm finally starting to see that clearly now. I did not utter a single word about having warned him. I am immensely proud of that restraint. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed as a father, but I kept the triumph out of my voice. I am right here, I assured him. Whenever you need me, for absolutely anything, I'm here. We proceeded to talk for nearly an hour, discussing the current projects at my firm, the upcoming football season, and completely ordinary topics. We spoke exactly the way we used to before everything changed. When I finally ended the call and looked up, Helen was standing right in the office doorway, watching me with a soft smile. "He's finally waking up," she whispered. "He always had a good head on his shoulders," I replied. "It just took some time." I will tell you exactly how the situation concluded because life-altering shifts usually happen without grand theatrics. They end quietly, with the simple click of a closing door. 7 months after the wedding took place, Ethan arrived for our traditional Sunday dinner completely alone once again. He had been making these solo visits a regular habit, and we never pried, nor did he offer unsolicited explanations. But that particular Sunday, right in the middle of clearing the main course, he set his fork down flat on the table. "I made a monumental mistake," he stated plainly. The admission was delivered without any remaining shame or defensiveness. It was spoken with the absolute clarity of a man who has completely finished lying to himself. I tied myself to someone who looked at me and saw an opportunity, rather than a partner. And I allowed things to happen to this family that I should have stopped instantly. "Ethan," Helen began softly, reaching across the table. "I should have stood up right at the reception, Dad," he interrupted, looking directly into my eyes. "The second I saw where they sat you, I knew it was wrong. I knew exactly what was happening, and I stayed quiet." The entire dining room fell completely silent. "Why didn't you say something, son?" I asked. My voice carried no residual anger. I was genuinely seeking to understand his mindset. He dropped his gaze down to his plate. "Because I desperately convinced myself it was just a temporary phase. I thought she would eventually soften up. I believed that if I just swallowed my pride and kept the peace long enough, everything would smooth out. Do you know what I've discovered about sacrificing your principles just to keep the peace?" I asked him gently. "It isn't actually peace, Ethan. It's just artificial quiet. And temporary quiet is a very dangerous thing to mistake for harmony." He officially filed the legal paperwork for separation 11 days later. I am not going to offer false sentimentality and pretend that I was brokenhearted over the dissolution of his marriage. I understand exactly how harsh that sounds. He is my flesh and blood, and the emotional toll he endured during those subsequent months was intensely real. I stood firmly by his side through every agonizing night of the initial transition, navigating the exhausting legal consults, dividing up the shared apartment assets, and surviving the first set of major holidays completely on his own. I showed up for every single bit of it, exactly as a father should. But I will never pretend that I mourned the permanent departure of Chloe from our family dynamic. The absolute final punctuation mark on the entire saga occurred the week the separation agreement was formally executed. Marcus Sterling placed a direct call to my office phone. I hadn't exchanged a single word with the man since our brief conversation on the stone terrace of the manor. "Arthur," his voice came through the speaker, "I just received the word." "Yes," I replied. "It's done. I want to say I'm sorry it came to this." "Don't be," I said evenly. "Your daughter made her definitive set of choices, and my son is currently executing his." Marcus paused for a long beat, the sound of ice clinking against glass audible through the line. "She explicitly told me that you flatly refused to provide a single cent for their secondary honeymoon trip. She claims you were intentionally malicious about the refusal." "Marcus," I stated calmly. I delivered a single clear syllable. I told her no. That was the entirety of the conversation. If stating a clear boundary is your family's definition of malice, then we are operating with completely irreconcilable dictionaries. He remained silent on the other end for what felt like an eternity. Then, he let out a slow, exhausted sigh. She always did prefer her mother's highly colored version of reality. I imagine so. Another prolonged pause stretched between us. "For whatever it's worth now, Arthur, I really should have written that check for the venue." "Yes," I replied, staring out at the horizon. You really should have. Marcus let out a short, hollow laugh, mirroring the exact interaction we had shared on the terrace months prior. Take care of that young man, he said quietly. I have never stopped doing that, I answered, and disconnected the line. It has now been 14 months since that lavish wedding took place at the manor. Ethan is currently settled into a comfortable, modest apartment closer to the city, backed by an exceptional legal representative, and operating with a clearer, more focused mindset than I have seen from him in over 2 years. This past Saturday, he came out to the house early in the morning to help me completely reshingle the detached garage roof, a major structural maintenance project we had been meaning to tackle for 3 consecutive summers. We labored side by side from 8 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the steady rhythm of our hammers filling the weekend air. Helen stepped out at midday to hand us fresh sandwiches and cold drinks, while our old retriever kept attempting to climb the base of the extension ladder to join us. At 4, as we were finally organizing the tarps and packing the toolboxes back into the truck bed, Ethan turned to me. Thanks for never throwing the "I told you so" in my face, Dad, he said quietly. Don't think the thought didn't cross my mind, son, I replied with a wry smile. I know. Probably about 400 times, right? He let out a genuine, unburdened laugh, the first completely relaxed smile I had seen grace his face in a very long time. I really should have listened to your perspective from the start, he admitted, looking down at his boots. Yes, you should have, I agreed, clapping a heavy hand onto his shoulder. But the important thing is that you finally arrived at the right destination on your own feet. He gave a solid nod of agreement. I handed him a cold drink and the two of us sat down together on the lowered tailgate of my pickup truck, quietly watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the expansive yard. It is a piece of property that now officially, legally, and permanently belongs to Helen alone. It is the exact yard featuring the wooden fence line I have personally maintained every single Sunday afternoon for over 20 years. It is our home, and it is a structure that no outside force will ever strip away from us. As the sky turned to amber, my mind drifted back to the crowded reception hall at table 7. I recalled the exact tone of Chloe's voice as she leaned down and whispered, "You're here as our guest," as though my presence were a minor concession. I thought about the financial draft bearing all those zeros that had completely purchased the most beautiful day of her entire life, a transaction that ultimately earned me nothing but a folding chair at a secondary table in a room she couldn't have dreamed of affording without my life's labor. I smiled to myself, thinking about the power of 2 simple words. No. That was the first set. But as I sat there with my son, I leaned into the final set of words, the ones I had carried closely in my mind for 14 months. The principles that cost me absolutely nothing to maintain, yet managed to give me my entire life back. My home, my rules, my son, my call. Some men navigate their entire adult lives never understanding the sheer weight of being rendered completely invisible inside a room they entirely funded. I am no longer one of those men. And Chloe Sterling Vance, who is currently in the middle of the legal process to strip our family name from her documents, will never receive a single additional dollar from my estate. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. She desperately wanted to treat me as an outside guest. I simply became one. If you enjoyed this raw look at family justice, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next time a villain learns their lesson.